Nonetheless,
Yeah.
you killed 7 men.
Yes, you
And I'm
did.
asking you, what got you to kill the 7
And I'm
men?
telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't you
not,
get it?
not everybody is killing 7 people.
On October 8th, 2002, one day before her execution, Aileen Wuornos lashed out in her interview, accusing the cops of framing her and claiming she'd been tortured on death row with a sonic weapon. These are female serial killers flipping out at disrespectful interviews.
At the time you were convicted, was there a lot of talk in the newspapers about that conviction?
Yes, sir.
What did they say?
All they said all kinds of nasty things.
Do you think they were right?
No, sir.
October 12, 1954. For years, Nannie Doss had perfected her role as the sweet, smiling grandmother everyone adored. With her warm laughter and charming demeanor, she seemed incapable of harm. But on that day, her carefully crafted facade shattered for good. Doctors had uncovered a chilling truth. Her husband, Samuel Doss, hadn't died of a natural cause. His body was loaded with arsenic, and suddenly, all eyes turned to his grieving widow. As investigators began peeling back the layers of her story, what they found was far more terrifying than a single murder. Nannie's seemingly ordinary life was a carefully masked nightmare. Behind the smiles and soft-spoken charm was a trail of death that stretched back for decades. And the most disturbing part? She giggled as she confessed. Let's go back to 1905. Nannie's story began in Blue Mountain, Alabama, where she grew up on a modest family farm. Life was tough, school wasn't an option, and most of her days were spent tending to chores. At 7, Nannie would suffer a head injury on a train that she would later blame for everything that came next. As a teenager, she would find an escape in romance magazines. Lonely Hearts columns became her favorite thing. She would read them, dreaming of finding the perfect man to sweep her off her feet. But reality doesn't really work like those love stories. And when reality fell short, Nannie didn't wait around for a happy ending. She made her own, no matter how dark it got. At just 16, Nannie married Charlie Braggs, a man she had known for 4 months. And together, they had 4 kids and lived with Charlie's overbearing mother. But here lies the issue. Nannie had just escaped her controlling father, only to land in a marriage where her mother-in-law ruled the house. By 1927, things fell apart. Tragically, 2 of their children died mysteriously. They were healthy one day and then gone the next. Charlie must have suspected something because he decided to leave Nannie at that point, taking their eldest daughter with him. But it wouldn't take long for Nannie to move on. By 1929, she married her second husband, Frank Harrelson, an alcoholic she met through, you guessed it, a Lonely Hearts column. They were together for 16 years, and those years weren't easy. Frank was abusive, and Nannie kept smiling through it all, until one day she didn't. 1945, after a night of heavy drinking, Frank's moonshine was spiked with poison. A week later, he was dead, and Nannie was collecting some life insurance money. By now, Nannie had developed a routine. She'd meet a guy through a Lonely Hearts ad, charm him with her warm demeanor, and when things didn't work out, when they cheated, drank too much, or even annoyed her, she would get rid of them. Simple as that. Arlie Lanning, husband number 3, met her through yet another ad. He was a heavy drinker as well, and his death in 1952 seemed like a heart attack. No one suspected Nannie. Then came Richard Morton, her 4th husband, who was pretty unfaithful. But Nannie didn't find out until later. She was too busy caring for her mother and sister, both of whom died suddenly under her watch. And finally, there's Samuel Doss, the 5th and last husband. He was different, not abusive or a drinker, but he made the mistake of limiting Nannie's TV time and magazines to educational content. Ooh, that was enough for her to lace a prune cake with poison. When Samuel didn't die right away and ended up in a hospital, she poisoned his coffee when he came home. This time, though, her plan worked. Now, Samuel's doctor had been suspicious of his illness during his hospital stay. So when Nannie made the fatal mistake of agreeing to an autopsy, she unknowingly handed him the proof he needed. The results confirmed what the doctor had suspected all along. Samuel had been poisoned. Nannie was arrested, and it wouldn't take long for her to start talking. She confessed to killing 4 of the 5 husbands she had, laughing as she described how she did it. She said,
I was searching for the perfect mate.
romance magazine she claimed had shaped her idea of love, and when reality didn't match that fantasy, she would kill and move on to the next. What's more, although she did confess to killing her husbands, authorities suspected her death toll was much higher, likely at least 12 victims, including several of her own family members. Nannie earned the chilling nickname, the Giggling Granny, for her unnerving habit of laughing while describing her crimes. But despite her past confessions, when Nannie appeared in a rare televised interview, she claimed she was innocent, insisting that she had only confessed because her lawyer told her to do it.
Why are you in the penitentiary now?
All the times I killed my husband.
Did they say you killed any more?
Yes.
Your other husband? Which other? Did you?
No.
Yet watching her in that interview, with that constant smile plastered on her face, you could tell she loved the attention. It seemed less about clearing her name and more about preserving this sweet grandmotherly image she had cultivated for so long. Oh, and as for being remorseful, yeah, there wasn't a trace of it.
Nannie, what would you like to have more than anything else in the world?
Well, my freedom first. And the next I like a small TV on my room.
She spent the remainder of her life in prison, still cheerful and unapologetic, until her death in 1964. Her story remains one of the most unsettling in true crime history, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most ordinary, which brings us to this next serial killer. It's November 2nd, 1984, and we're outside North Carolina's Central Prison, where 2 very different groups gathered for one woman. On one side, we have candles glowing in the hands of those singing hymns, praying for Velma Barfield, a grandmother and devoted Christian. On the other, angry chants filled the air. Die, bitch, die. These were the voices of people who wanted justice for the lives she'd taken. Now inside, we have Velma, sitting quietly, awaiting her fate. She was about to become the first woman in the U.S. to be executed by lethal injection. It was hard for many to reconcile the image of Velma, sweet, smiling, and seemingly harmless, with the horrifying truth about her. Now, she wasn't just connected to one suspicious death, but at least 6, including her own mother, 2 husbands, and her fiancé. Now, her son Ronnie once captured the disbelief around her, saying,
You know, it's the saddest thing. But it seems like everybody my mother ever gets close to dies. How could the good Lord allow this to happen to a faithful Christian like Velma Barfield?
The answer? It wasn't the good Lord allowing this to happen. It was Velma herself. Now, to most people who knew Velma, it seemed like tragedy would follow her wherever she went. But in 1978, when her fiancé, Stuart Taylor, died suddenly, the story began to shift. Stuart's autopsy revealed something shocking: arsenic in his system. When police questioned Velma, she admitted she poisoned him, but her reasoning? She said that she had only meant to make him sick. The explanation didn't hold up, and under pressure, Velma broke down and confessed. And the more she talked, the darker the story became. The death started years earlier, with Velma's first husband, Thomas Burke. Their marriage had been a struggle, and then on one night, Thomas died in a house fire. It was a tragedy, or so everyone thought. Velma's second husband now, Jennings Barfield, also died suddenly. His symptoms were severe: vomiting, burning pain, and a rapid decline of health. At the time, no one connected the dots. Then came her mother, Lillian. Now, she had moved in with Velma after a hip injury, only to fall ill with the same symptoms as Jennings. And she wouldn't be the last. Velma began caring for the elderly, now working for Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, followed by Record Lee. They would all trust her completely. They relied on her for care, meals, and even companionship. They didn't sign up for their food and drinks to be laced with arsenic, though. Every time someone became an inconvenience or a burden, Velma's solution was disturbingly simple: just poison them. Now, she was eventually convicted and sentenced to death, becoming the first American woman sent to the execution chamber since the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976. Now, her case quickly turned into a media frenzy. You had reporters, with the public, fixated on the unassuming grandmother now known as Death Row Granny. So while awaiting her execution, Velma embraced a new identity as this born-again Christian. She gained support from death penalty opponents and even religious communities who saw her as a redeemed soul. We're not joking here. Even Reverend Billy Graham visited her prison and famously told her, "Velma, in a way, I envy you, because you're gonna get to heaven before I do." Now that might have comforted Velma, but it wouldn't sit well with the families of her victims. You see, to them, Velma wasn't a misunderstood figure or even a tragic soul. This bitch was a cold-blooded killer who had betrayed the trust of those closest to her. Now, during her time on death row, Velma gave a televised interview with WBTV. In it, she painted herself as a victim of circumstance, speaking about heartbreak, loneliness, and isolation that she would face in prison. She seemed to focus on her suffering, her losses, and the pain of being away from her family.
It's total, isolation from everybody that I had been with for almost 6 years. Living in prison every day is a struggle.
Yeah, for many though, the interview was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a woman carrying the weight of a tragedy. She was the one who caused it. Her words, instead of showing some remorse, felt self-serving and dismissive of the pain she had inflicted on others. But you know what? On November 2nd, 1984, Velma's story came to an end. Her last meal was as unremarkable as it gets. A bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola, exactly what God wanted her to eat. And when asked how she felt about her execution, she smiled and said,
It's my gateway to heaven.
This woman walks calmly to the execution chamber, showing no fear. Witnesses later said her death was peaceful, as she simply relaxed, with this lethal injection taking effect, and drifted off as if just falling asleep. It was quick, painless, and a sharp contrast to the slow, agonizing deaths her victims endured.
Because, first of all, women generally don't commit crimes this heinous.
Right.
This is usually the domain of men.
That's unfortunate.
You think more women?
Oh, yeah, equal opportunity, definitely.
Welcome to August 5th, 2009. Firefighters are called to a trash bin fire in a residential area in Phoenix, Arizona. And dear God, what they found shocked even the most hardened investigators. Fingerprints later identified the victim as 46-year-old Terry Neely, a wheelchair-bound resident of a local assisted care facility. But the real horror came later, during investigation, when Angela Simpson, a 33-year-old woman already in jail for another crime, confessed to the murder. It wasn't just the gruesome details of the crime that left everyone stunned. Angela didn't just confess, she bragged.
Look, I heard they said I was possessed by the devil. I think that's hilarious. Isn't that beautiful?
Unlike the others on this list, Angela only killed one person, but her attitude, her complete lack of remorse, and the way she described her crime with such unsettling ease made it clear. If she hadn't been caught, she would have killed again. And it's not just speculation. Angela herself admitted she regretted not having the chance to kill more. Her cold-hearted confession was so chilling that it reportedly inspired the fictional psychopathic hitwoman, Villanelle, the unforgettable character in the thriller series, Killing Eve.
Simpson, I think, is a very scary individual. She's probably the only one in there that I would take every precaution in the world to make sure my staff and myself are safe.
It's August 2nd, 2009. Our horrifying story begins with Terry Neely leaving his assisted care facility in his wheelchair. Angela Simpson, someone Neely apparently knew, had lured him into her apartment with promises of sex and drugs. But once inside, the situation turned into a complete nightmare. Over the course of 3 days, Angela inflicted unimaginable acts of torture on Neely. She beat him with a tire iron, stabbed him at least 50 times, hammered a 3-inch nail into his skull, and even extracted his teeth one by one. To make it even worse, she placed a mirror in front of him during his torture so he could watch, and as Angela later put it,
he needed to see what he deserved.
Eventually, she ended his torment by strangling him with a television cord and then slashing his throat. But Angela didn't stop there. She dismembered him and then threw the remains of his body into a residential trash bin, which then she would set on fire to cover her tracks. Angela thought she was going to get away with this. But unbeknownst to her, the assisted care facility where Neely lived had already reported him missing, and her attempt to dispose of his remains failed when the fire department arrived in time. Fingerprints confirmed the body was Neely's, and police quickly launched an investigation. Originally, the investigation led him to Edward McFarland, a friend of Angela's. Witnesses reported seeing smoke coming from McFarland's apartment and noticed the City of Phoenix trash can inside his kitchen. Not only this, but one witness claimed Angela had confessed to killing Neely and even threatened him to stay quiet about it or else she'd kill him too. When Angela and McFarland were questioned by police, they were already in jail for an unrelated armed robbery, and Angela didn't hold back. She openly admitted to the murder, showing no remorse whatsoever.
Is it hard to chop up a human body? Yeah, not really. Don't. You'd be amazed. It's quite simple, actually. You should try it. It's only a felony 6. Knock it down to a misdemeanor.
Now, Angela justified her actions by claiming Neely was a snitch who deserved to die. The police, however, found no evidence that Neely had ever acted as an informant. But that didn't matter to Angela. She admitted that her only regret was not being able to kill more snitches. During a 2009 interview right after her arrest, she said,
I don't want my children or the people I consider family to be in a place where there are snitches. I believe informants and molesters should be killed. Period.
March 2012. Angela pled guilty to first-degree murder and was given life in prison without parole. On the day of her sentencing, she gave another unsettling interview. When asked if she would kill again, she replied without hesitation,
If the opportunity arises, I hope so.
March 2013. Over just 10 days, Joanna Dennehy turned Peterborough, England, into the scene of one of the country's most disturbing murder sprees. 3 men were brutally killed, and 2 others barely survived her attacks. But what made Joanna's case even more horrifying wouldn't be just the violence. It was her attitude. She didn't kill out of desperation, revenge, or even necessity. She killed because she liked how it felt. Her lack of remorse, combined with her desire to kill more, made her one of the UK's most chilling criminals. She openly admitted that she was inspired by the infamous Bonnie and Clyde and wanted to kill 9 men in total. Thank God her spree ended before she hit that number, but not before she left a trail of horror in her wake. Joanna Dennehy didn't have an easy start in life, but it wasn't the kind of upbringing most people would expect from someone who turned into a killer. Back in 1982, she was born in St. Albans, Hertfordshire, into a seemingly normal middle-class family. But as a teenager, Joanna started rebelling, and at 16 she ran away from home with her older boyfriend, John Traynor. Now by 17, Joanna was pregnant with her first child, but motherhood wouldn't be something that she wanted, and right after her daughter was born, she sank into drugs and alcohol. Traynor later said in this interview,
She came out of the hospital and the first thing on her mind was to get stoned.
Despite their toxic relationship, they had a second child in 2005, but by then Joanna's behavior was spiraling out of control. She cheated, self-harmed, and created a dangerous environment for everyone around her. Traynor eventually left, taking the kids with him. Looking back, it was the right call. By 2013, Joanna had moved to Peterborough, where she met Gary Richards, better known as Stretch due to his 7-foot frame. Now, Stretch was utterly smitten with Joanna, and the pair became inseparable. He would soon become the Clyde to her Bonnie. Joanna's first victim was 34-year-old Lukasz Szlabajuszki. They met in Peterborough, and Lukasz, thinking she was interested in him romantically, followed her to this empty house owned by her landlord. Joanna blindfolds him and lures him into this false sense of security, and then stabs him in the heart. His body is then left in a dumpster while she plans her next move. 10 days later, she struck again. Her second victim was 56-year-old John Chapman, one of her housemates. He was stabbed to death just like Lukasz. And hours later, Joanna turned on their landlord, Kevin Lee, with whom she'd been having an affair. Before stabbing Kevin, though, she humiliated him by forcing him to wear this black sequin dress. So after the murders, Joanna had Stretch and this other guy, Leslie Layton, help her dispose of the bodies. Together, they dumped the victims' remains in rural ditches outside Peterborough. And to make matters even more grotesque for you, Joanna posed Kevin Lee's body in a sexually explicit position as a final act of mockery. Later, the 2 guys claimed that they only helped her because they were terrified of her. Even though Stretch towered over Joanna, standing nearly 2 feet taller than her, he said she was the one who intimidated him. Now, the murders just weren't enough for Joanna. On the way back from dumping those bodies, she told Stretch,
I want my fun. I need you to get me my fun.
The trio drove to the town of Hereford, where Joanna attacked 2 strangers, Robin Bereza and John Rogers, who were just out walking their dogs. She stabbed Bereza in the shoulder and chest and then turned on Rogers, stabbing him 40 more times. Miraculously, somehow both men survived and were able to identify Joanna in court. When asked why she only targeted men, Joanna claimed it was because she was a mother and didn't want to harm women, especially not mothers. You see, to her, killing men was entertainment. And after her first murder, she admitted, "I got a taste for it." The spree ended shortly after Kevin Lee's family reported him missing. 2 days later, police found his body in a ditch. Joanna was quickly identified as the prime suspect, and when she found out, she fled with Stretch. However, that run didn't last long. Within 48 hours, police tracked her down. Her arrest was almost as disturbing as her crimes. She laughed, joked, and even flirted with the officers who processed her, treating this whole thing like a game.
I got to the rear to the front, I'm to the back to that.
One rifle, attempted murder, and burglary.
Eventually, Joanna Dennehy pled guilty to all charges, including 3 murders and 2 attempted murders. The judge gave her life in prison without the possibility of release, calling her a cruel, calculating, and manipulative serial killer. She became one of only 3 women in the UK to receive a whole life sentence, joining notorious killers Rosemary West and Myra Hindley. Even in prison, Joanna caused trouble. She formed these romantic relationships with fellow inmates, including Haley Palmer, with whom she attempted a suicide pact in 2018. Joanna would also make enemies, though. She once threatened the life of fellow serial killer Rosemary West, forcing prison officials to transfer West for her safety. And God knows what else she's doing behind bars. Staring at a whole life sentence, she has all the time in the world to plot her next move or create her next mess. Now, when you go to a clinic for treatment, you put your trust in the people caring for you. For patients at DaVita Dialysis Clinic in Lufkin, Texas, that trust was shattered in the spring of 2008. Now, what should have been a place of healing turned into a house of horrors, with patients collapsing, coding, and even dying during routine dialysis sessions. At the center of all of this was Kimberly Sains, a nurse whose job was to save lives. But instead, she would use her position to take them. Her weapon? Bleach. Kimberly Clark Sains grew up in Texas, where she seemed, at least on the surface, like an ordinary woman. She was a cheerleader in high school and became a mom at 17, and eventually went to nursing school, earning her vocational nursing license. But underneath this normal exterior was a very troubled person with a string of red flags. Before working at DaVita, Kimberly had already been fired from at least 4 healthcare jobs. In one instance, her bosses caught her stealing Demerol and tampering with a drug test to hide it. She was also arrested for public intoxication and even domestic disturbances. But despite all this, DaVita thought she was a perfect candidate. By 2008, she was married with 2 young kids, but she struggled with drug addiction and this erratic behavior. And while the patients at DaVita trusted her with their lives, Kimberly would betray them in ways no one could have imagined. It started early in 2008. Patients at the DaVita Dialysis Clinic began falling seriously ill during treatments. They would experience sudden drops in blood pressure, cardiac arrests, and other crazy medical emergencies. And by April, paramedics were called into the clinic nearly every day, 30 times that month alone. For anyone familiar with dialysis, this was shocking. Emergencies like this are rare under normal circumstances. Something was clearly wrong, and it wasn't just bad luck. And it didn't stop. April 1st, 2008, 2 patients, Velma Metcalf and Clara Strange, went into cardiac arrest and died during their treatments. Still, these deaths were written off as natural causes, but when more patients kept collapsing, it was clear something sinister was going on. April 28th, with health inspectors on site now, the truth started to come to light. 2 patients, Marva Rohn and Carolyn Reisinger, suddenly became critically ill. Witnesses reported seeing Kimberly Sains drawing bleach into syringes and injecting it into the patient's dialysis lines. When her supervisor confronted her, Kimberly said she was just cleaning a machine and needed the syringe to measure bleach, a practice that was against clinic policy. Tests on the syringes and cleaning equipment confirmed the presence of bleach. Kimberly was fired the next day, but the damage was already done. And as investigators dug deeper, they discovered a horrifying pattern. Kimberly had been present for every single emergency that occurred at that clinic in April. Forensic experts found out that when bleach entered a patient's bloodstream, it would cause hemolysis, essentially destroying their red blood cells and leading to cardiac arrest. Even Kimberly's internet search history was damning. She was looking up questions like, "Can bleach kill?" Coworkers also reported that she openly disliked certain patients, many of whom either died or coded. One coworker even recalled that Kimberly went out for a cigarette break after a patient collapsed, refusing to check on him. By May 2008, Kimberly was arrested and charged with 5 counts of capital murder and 5 counts of aggravated assault. But despite everything they already uncovered, investigators still feared they wouldn't be able to prove their case. At the time, detecting bleach in blood was nearly impossible, and they needed a breakthrough to tie her actions directly to the deaths. Well, that breakthrough came from Mark Sachaski, a bioterrorism expert who developed a test to detect chlorotyrosine, a marker of bleach exposure, in blood samples. His findings were conclusive. 9 patients showed signs of exposure to bleach, and that, my friends, was all the prosecutors needed. By March 2012, Kimberly Sains stood trial for her crimes. The jury heard testimony from grieving families and former co-workers who had described how she betrayed the trust of the very people she was supposed to care for. The evidence was overwhelming. By March 31, 2012, a jury found Kimberly guilty of killing 5 patients and injuring 5 others. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and even after conviction, questions remained. The CDC linked Kimberly to far more deaths than the 5 for which she was charged. In the 5 months before her firing, 19 patients had died at that clinic, a number far above the state average. Investigators believed Kim may have been responsible for many of those deaths, but with limited evidence, they couldn't pursue additional charges. 2023, Kimberly Sains sits down for an interview with Piers Morgan, saying that she wanted the world to hear her side of the story. She said that her only goal was to help the people at DaVita Dialysis Clinic and insisted that she had been wrongly convicted.
I was falsely accused of something, and that's why I'm here today. But I know that I didn't do anything that would have done anything to harm another patient, another person.
But things didn't go the way she might have planned. Because Piers, known for his hard-hitting interviews, didn't hold back. He pushed her to confront the damning evidence, asking her to admit to her crimes. Cornered, Kimberly lashed out, accusing Morgan of being biased, and even claiming that he was being paid by DaVita to tarnish her name.
I really thought you were going to help me.
Help you what?
Help me to get the truth out. Thanks a lot.
I think we did get the truth out.
I guess he got in your pockets too.
Sure. What about my pockets?
I guess DaVita got in your pocket too.
Today, Kimberly Sains is still serving her life sentence in a Texas prison. Her crimes remind us of how dangerous someone can be when they abuse their position of trust. The clinic, DaVita, later claimed that they had no way of knowing Kimberly was a danger. But for the victims' families, that answer wasn't enough. And as one victim's daughter put it during the trial,
"You are nothing more than a psychopathic serial killer. I hope you burn in hell."
I willingly got into something that completely took control over me, that I lost control of myself behind drugs.
We take you to 1967. Susan Atkins is sitting in a house in San Francisco, surrounded by dope dealers and chaos. Now, she'd been drifting for years, bouncing from one bad situation to another, looking for something, anything to give her life meaning. Then a man walked in, holding a guitar. Susan was mesmerized. In that moment, she felt seen, like he understood her in a way no one else ever could. And when Charles Manson smiled at her, she did not hesitate. Within hours, they were upstairs, and within days, Susan left everything behind to follow him. Now, she had no idea she had just taken the first step toward a life of chaos, and eventually murder. But before she met Manson, Susan's life was already unraveling. May 7th, 1948, born in Northern California, she grew up in a middle-class home that was far from happy. Both of her parents were alcoholics, and she later claimed that a male relative had sexually abused her. Things would fall apart completely when her mother died of cancer. At just 15, Susan lost the one stable figure in her life. Her father, struggling to cope with this, had left Susan and her siblings with relatives while he searched for work. Feeling abandoned and alone, Susan began to spiral. She drops out of high school, moves to San Francisco, and falls in with this bad crowd. By her late teens, she's running with 2 convicts, participating in robberies, and even spent some time in an Oregon prison. She took odd jobs, including topless dancing, to make ends meet. And by the time she met Charlie Manson, Susan was lost, vulnerable, and desperate for someone to tell her she mattered. So Susan quickly became part of the Manson family. He promised her love and acceptance, and she believed every word. Manson even gave her a new name, Sadie Mae Glutz, saying it would help kill her ego. At first, life with the family seemed idyllic. They moved to Spawn Ranch, an old movie set outside of LA, and lived in what felt like this freedom town away from society's rules. But Manson's grip on his followers tightened. This guy used LSD, orgies, and endless lectures to manipulate them. He fed them his delusions about an impending race war he called Helter Skelter, convincing them that they had a role to play in bringing it about. Susan, completely devoted to Manson, was willing to do anything he asked. July 1969. Susan takes part in her first murder. Now, Manson sent her, along with 2 other followers, to confront Gary Hinman, a musician who had supposedly wronged him. When Hinman refused to give him money, Manson slashed his face with a samurai sword and left. Now, for 3 days, Susan and the others tortured Hinman, stitching his face with dental floss before finally killing him. Afterward, they used his blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall, hoping to frame the Black Panthers for the crime. A few weeks later, on August 8, 1969, Manson gave Susan and 3 others their most infamous order: go to a house in the Hollywood Hills and kill everyone inside. The house belonged to actress Sharon Tate and her husband, director Roman Polanski. Sharon would be 8 months pregnant at the time. Susan, along with Charles Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, snuck into this house, and what happened next would be a scene of unimaginable horror. Susan later admitted to holding Sharon Tate down while Watson stabbed her. Tate would beg for her life and the life of her unborn baby, but all Susan said to her was,
"Woman, I have no mercy for you."
Before leaving, Watson told Susan to leave a message. Using a towel dipped in Tate's blood, she wrote "pig" on the front door. 2 days later, Susan joined the family for another murderous mission. This time they target Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. By October 1969, the Manson family's killing spree was over. Susan was arrested for her involvement in Hinman's murder, but in jail, she couldn't help but brag. She told her cellmates about the Tate murders, even claiming that she had tasted Sharon Tate's blood. Well, her confessions unraveled the Manson family's crimes and led to their infamous trial. Now, initially, Susan was given death, but then it was commuted to life in prison when California abolished the death penalty in 1972. 5 years into her sentence, though, Susan Atkins sat down for this interview that just left many viewers deeply unsettled. Dressed neatly with her hair perfectly styled, she appeared calm, collected, and disturbingly composed. And as she spoke about the Tate murders, there wasn't a single tear, not a flicker of guilt for the lives she had helped destroy.
But that we were instructed to go all the way down every house, hit every house on the
street?
The street, yes.
And kill all the people in those houses?
People in all those houses.
It seemed as if Susan was trying to paint herself as this harmless young woman, misguided, manipulated by Manson, and in her words, a victim of his control. Her low, sweet voice added to the picture that she was trying to create, as if to say,
"I didn't really want to do this. I was just caught up in something bigger than me."
I had gone so far and there was no turning back. That even if I had wanted to run, even if I had wanted to leave, I couldn't. It was like I was caught in something that I had no control over. I had absolutely no say-so as to what was happening now. It was just like a tool in the hands of the devil.
But then something shifted. Her calm demeanor began to crack as the topic turned to drugs, particularly acid. Her voice grew louder, more forceful, and the composed act she'd been putting on seemed to fade away, as she claimed the drugs had pushed her to do unspeakable things, almost as if they had made her powerless to stop herself.
You'd have to understand what acid does to the mind in order to understand how a person can get confused behind drugs.
As years passed, Susan claimed to find redemption. She became a born-again Christian, married twice, and then tried to paint herself as a changed woman. But the parole board wasn't buying it. She was denied parole 12 times, even as her health declined. In her final years, Susan suffered from brain cancer that left her paralyzed. On September 24th, 2009, she died in prison. Her husband said that her last word was "Amen." And finally, we take you to October 9th, 2002. Aileen Wuornos sat quietly, sipping a cup of coffee, the only thing she requested before her execution. When the time came, she was strapped to the gurney, and when asked if she had any final words, she gave this bizarre statement.
I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back.
God is going to be there. Jesus Christ is going to be there. All the angels and everything. And, whatever's on the beyond, I think it's going to be more like Star Trek beaming me up into a space vehicle, man.
Now, if a psychologist had to invent a childhood that could produce a killer, Aileen Wuornos' life might be the blueprint. February 29th, 1956, Rochester, Michigan. Aileen didn't really have a chance to get to know her father. Now, he was a convicted sex offender who hanged himself in prison before she turned 2. Then her mother abandoned her and her older brother soon after, leaving them with their grandparents. But these weren't your typical sweet grandparents. Her grandmother had died of liver failure when Aileen was still young, but her grandfather, according to her later accounts, was physically and sexually abusing her for years. So at 15, Aileen had dropped out of school and gave birth to a baby, reportedly fathered by one of her grandfather's friends. Now, the child was put up for adoption, but after a violent confrontation with her grandfather, Aileen found herself homeless, living in the woods near Troy, Michigan. Now, she would survive by trading sex for food, cigarettes, and money, a pattern that would follow her into adulthood. At 20, Aileen hitchhiked to Florida, hoping for a fresh start. There, she married 69-year-old yacht club president Louis Fell, thinking that she had finally found stability. But it didn't take long for things to fall apart. You see, Aileen had a temper, and she was pretty self-destructive. She started bar fights, even abused Fell, at one point beating him with his own cane, and would get herself into so much trouble that Fell filed for a restraining order just after 9 weeks of marriage. Now, around this time, her brother had died of esophageal cancer. Aileen inherited $10,000 from his life insurance policy, but that money didn't last. She spent it on a luxury car which she crashed while drunk driving, and soon she was back to surviving the only way she knew: prostitution and petty crime. But now this time, her life would take a much darker and bloodier turn. Between 1989 and 90, Aileen had killed 7 men, all of whom she met while working as a prostitute along Florida's highways. Her first victim, Richard Mallory, was a convicted sex offender, and Aileen claimed that she killed him in self-defense. She shot him many times, dumping his body in the woods and then abandoned his car. But Mallory wouldn't be the last, because over the next year, she killed 6 more. Her motives were unclear. Sometimes she said it was self-defense, saying they assaulted her. Other times she admitted to just robbing them. Whatever the reason, though, it became clear that Aileen was unraveling, driven by years of trauma, mistrust, and anger. In January 1991, Aileen's downfall began when she got into this fight at a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida. Police arrested her on this outstanding warrant, and by then, they already connected her to the murders through fingerprints and stolen items. But the real breakthrough came when her girlfriend, Tyria Moore, was caught in Pennsylvania. Tyria agreed to snitch on her to the police for immunity, and she called Aileen from a motel, pretending to be terrified that the police would pin everything on her. So, over 4 days of calls, Tyria coaxed a confession out of Aileen, who admitted to the killings but insisted that some were in self-defense. In January 1992, Aileen went on trial for those murders. She was eventually convicted and sentenced to death. Her time on death row would be marked by paranoia and erratic behavior. She said the prison staff was tampering with her food, claiming that her body was being attacked by sonic weapons, and she would frequently go on hunger strikes.
They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997.
In 2001, she asked the court to expedite her execution, saying that she just couldn't take it anymore. In a written statement, she declared,
I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again.
October 9th, 2002. Aileen Wuornos got that wish. She was put to death at 9:47 a.m. that day.
You sabotaged my society and the cops and the system. A raped woman got executed.